Hello everyone. So I am going to use this PowerPoint to talk you through the family diversity topic, and this will take you through the rest of this week because I am going to be very busy doing your appointments for reviews first of all, and then also writing them up. So I'm going to set all of your work today, but this PowerPoint does have lesson breaks in it, which you can use if you wish to, but ultimately you can do it however you want as long as you get this all done this week. So yeah, there'll be enough for one lesson and then a big slide that says lesson break, so you can stop there, the next lesson break, so it'll be in sort of manageable chunks if you want to follow that. So initially then, we need to think about what it is that you need to know in terms of this topic. So this topic is family diversity, and we're thinking about how diversity exists and whether there's more of it or less of it and whether it's a good thing or not. And we're going to be looking specifically at two time periods in order to consider this. So we're going to be looking at modernity and then postmodernity and the ways that family diversity has changed over the course of those two eras. And the gist of it really is that in modernity there was less diversity than there is today, and then there's different arguments about whether that has been a good change or a bad change. We're going to look at different sociological explanations, so we'll be looking at the key thinkers and theories, and we'll be thinking about, particularly in the postmodernist part, the influence and the significance of this individual choice thing in personal relationships and how that has kind of led to people being less interested in the traditional family structure. This slide is sort of telling you the other topic areas that you may wish to link and bring into this debate. It's very much linked in particular with the changing family patterns stuff, because it's because of those changing family patterns that we've now got more diversity. So because of the changes in divorce and marriage and childbearing and things like that, that's why we've now got diversity of family types, which kind of also links in with demography quite heavily as well, in that the changes in the birth rate and the death rate and things have also led to lots of different family types. And in some ways, the structure of the families is very much linked to this idea of DDOL, but they're all relevant. All of these topic areas are relevant in here. So this is where we're trying to get you to think about how when you write an essay and answer a question, I don't want you to just think that's a question about family diversity, so I can only use that part of the pack. You need to be thinking about all the arguments that are relevant. And I think I'll probably talk a bit about that later on, because I've got a particular question for you to look at which explains that really well. So in terms of a bit of background, family diversity is the idea that there are lots of different family types. So there is diversity in the family, means there's lots of different family types. And as I said, we're going to be looking at modernity and postmodernity, because these two time periods are really important to sociologists, because they argue that family diversity changed most significantly during the transition from modernity to postmodernity. So here we go, modernity and postmodernity. That says the same as previous slide, that's my mistake. Okay, but here we go. So modernity is a period in time which was characterised by stability, traditional norms and values. And this period was really from industrialisation up into around the 80s. So modernity was a time when everyone kind of did the same thing. There were very traditional norms and values. People would get married and stay married in terms of the family. Everyone would have been in a nuclear family. There wouldn't really have been much divorce and that kind of thing. So that's what we're talking about in terms of modernity. Postmodernists argue that from the 80s, things changed really drastically and we entered a completely new era that no longer looked anything like modernity, modern society. And so they call it postmodernity. They're saying it's after modernity, it's a completely new era. Now, it's important to remember, as I think we've said before in class, that the existence of postmodernity is not a fact, it's an opinion put forward by postmodernist key thinkers, so they don't necessarily they're not necessarily right, in the same way that feminists think that society is patriarchal, and other theorists might disagree, in the same way that Marxists think that society is unequal in terms of class, and other theories might disagree. Postmodernists think that we're in a postmodern society where everything's diverse and everything's changed, and other sociologists might disagree. So just bear that in mind. So this is relating to the table in your pack. You need to fill in the appropriate information in the correct column as to whether they are talking about modernity or postmodernity. So this one, 1750, is the era of modernity, and then this one, 1980s onwards, is the era of postmodernity. That's what we just kind of talked about. In terms of the theories, you've got, from the modern era, functionalism is quite relevant, and definitely Marxism, definitely the new right. In feminism, it's kind of both, really. I'm going to put a B for both, because feminism really sort of was introduced most prominently, I guess, in the early 1900s with the suffragette movement, but that was firmly in the modern era. So that was in the modern era, but you also have feminism, which is very much sort of influential today, which is influenced by postmodern ideas, and you get postmodern feminists as well. So that can go in both columns, that one. Postmodernism obviously is in postmodernity, and I would argue again that social action is probably a bit of both. It's really like a late modern theory, because they don't necessarily, I'll put LM for late modern. And the reason for this, you may want to write it down, is that although they're a relatively sort of new approach, they wouldn't class themselves as postmodernists, because they won't necessarily agree that we live in a postmodern era, because that's the postmodernist idea. So I wouldn't want to put them in that category. They really sort of emerged in the late 1900s, although Weber was arguably the first social action theorist. But for the purpose of this table, they are kind of modern, but they're more late modern because they have newer ideas, but they're not postmodernists. I hope that makes sense. And please email me if it doesn't, or do a bit of research in terms of like the development of social action in comparison to postmodernism. That'd be a really good thing to do anyway. Key names. So we've got Parsons from the modern era. We have also got the Rapoports are from the modern era. Chester is in the late modern era. Yeah, and then we've got Beck is a postmodernist, Weeks is a postmodernist, Giddens is a postmodernist, and Stacey is also a postmodernist. And they're the key thinkers that we're going to be focusing on in the coming slides. So yeah, put those into the correct columns before you move on. Family types that are dominant, we've got in the modern era, the traditional nuclear family and the nuclear. And in the postmodern era, we've got single parent families, reconstituted and same-sex families. But also the nuclear is quite dominant in the postmodern era, so that can really go in both. And what I would suggest that you put here is ultimately that in the postmodern era, the whole point is that there's not a dominant family type, because there is just diversity of family types. So make sure you write that down, because it's not that single parent families are the most common, or that same sex are the most common, or that reconstituted are the most common. It's that diversity is what is happening, and there is no common family type as such. What are relationships like in these different eras? So for the modern column, you've got traditional relationships where the roles are based on the biological differences between the man and the woman, very much Parsons kind of thing. Whereas in postmodern society, postmodernists argue that the roles are more likely to be negotiated and discussed between the members of the family, and that we have more choice about our relationships rather than just being led by what was expected of us. We can choose a relationship that suits our needs. Why may these explanations not be useful? How can they be criticised? It's a bit outdated. The modern era is a bit outdated because the modern theories, because they mostly focus on modern times where things were very much kind of traditional and not diverse. However, postmodernists are criticised by other key thinkers who argue that they're over-exaggerating the amount of diversity there actually is. So this is what I was saying earlier, it's not a fact that we're in a postmodern society, it's an opinion. And some people would argue that postmodernist theorists are actually over-exaggerating the extent of diversity that is occurring in society today, and perhaps we're actually just in a late modern period where there's some change but not that much. And hopefully this will all become a bit clearer as we start to look at the key thinkers and their explanations. Is the nuclear family in decline or not, and why? For postmodernists, they would say it is in decline for many different reasons, but for people that think things have not changed that much, they might argue that the nuclear family is not really that in decline, perhaps a little bit, but the extent to which postmodernists say that it's in a decline, modernist approaches might say it's not actually that much. People still really value things like marriage and still have traditional and religious values. So modernist and postmodernist theorists have opposing views about the family, and much of this is due to the time in which they were or are writing. So this is an important topic to make sure that you pay attention to the dates for the key thinkers with. I'm not saying you have to remember the exact year, but if you can just pay attention to the rough kind of time period that they were writing in, then it helps make sense of their views and put them into context. And you can only really evaluate a key thinker based on whether they were right at that particular time. And you can say that they're outdated today and maybe not so useful, but that doesn't mean that they were never useful. They were useful at the time that they were being written. So we're going to start with Parsons, as we often do. Parsons, of course, is a functionalist, remember, and Parsons was writing for many decades, but most of his work on the family was between the 30s and the 50s. So obviously that tells you a lot instantly about the kinds of things he's going to have suggested. So he suggested that the nuclear family was what suited the needs of modern society at this time, and he was probably right about that. It did suit them. It did suit the needs of industrial society due to being socially mobile, geographically mobile, having the breadwinner and the housewife. It made sense at that time. So just take a minute, pause the slideshow and read through that section on Parsons, please. So pause now. Okay, and then in terms of evaluating, there's a question in your pack which asks you about the other family types that can perform the essential functions. So what I think would be useful is to write down here, choose a particular family type and explain how it could perform those essential functions. So for example, you might choose a same-sex couple and you might say that a same-sex couple can provide socialisation and the stabilisation of adult personalities, and that there can be a breadwinner and an expressive role in a same-sex couple. So this is suggesting that Parsons' theory may not be as relevant today as it was when he was writing, because he doesn't take that into account, that there are other family types that can perform the functions. Other things I just want you to make a note of are, I don't think it says in your pack about how he was mostly writing in the 30s and the 50s, and I think that's a really important thing to note down, that he was writing in the modern era in particular, and he was writing at this time when what he was saying was probably true. Additionally, I think you're going to need to make a note here of how this point is relevant to the topic we're looking at. So we're looking at family diversity and whether or not it exists and whether or not it's a good thing. And according to Parsons would have said at the time he was writing that diversity was not necessary and also not best for society. Most people were in the nuclear family and that was best, so there was no diversity and that diversity was not needed. You then got in your pack the New Right, and I've put a lovely picture here of a man called Charles Murray, because he was sort of the most influential person in this approach, really, at this time anyway. So the New Right ideology was most influential during the 70s, but we can definitely see its influence today as well. But this is when it really had its sort of golden time, I guess. So worth writing that down, that we're talking about the 70s here, so still in the modern era. And the New Right approach would argue that the traditional nuclear family, patriarchal nuclear family, is best for society. Worth making a note of Charles Murray's name as well, as a key thinker you can associate here. And pause the slideshow for a second and have a read of that section. In terms of evaluating this argument then, we can take feminism and how feminists would argue that this patriarchal nuclear family is too patriarchal and therefore not beneficial for women and actually quite oppressive for women. So while the New Right are saying that diversity is bad and that we need to stick to the patriarchal nuclear family, feminists would say actually we need more diversity to move away from that patriarchy and the oppression of women. And again, to link to the actual topic, the idea of diversity, you may wish to make a note of this, you should make a note of this, that in terms of diversity, what would Charles Murray and the New Right say about diversity? Their view on it would have been that it was bringing moral decay to society and it was creating a breakdown in society and that it was detrimental. That was their view of it at that time. And I would say that that's probably because they were seeing it beginning to happen. We were beginning to have more diversity at that time, and they were sort of seeing that as contributing to the breakdown of society. Remember that one of their main things is that single parent families are detrimental to society and create dependency culture. So that's the kind of link with diversity. We then got Chester, and I think this date is actually in your pack, but he was writing in the 1980s. So this might make you think that he was a postmodernist. But remember, just because someone was writing in that era, doesn't mean that he is a postmodernist. And he was writing in what he may have termed more of a period of late modernity. So things are changing, but they haven't actually changed that much. We're in a slightly different era, but we're not in a postmodern era, which is completely different from the previous time. So Chester argues things are changing a bit because they're becoming neo-conventional. As well, pleased with my straight line under neo there. But things are becoming neo-conventional. So what he's arguing here is that families are becoming a bit more equal, and both the man and the woman, as you can see in this picture here, both the man and the woman are now starting to work and both take care of the children. I don't think he means that the child is working on an iPad necessarily, but that both parents are more involved in those. It's a dual earner family and they're both more involved in the childcare, similar to the symmetrical family, different term for it. And it's more equal. And Chester also talks about the role of grandparents in this, because often the grandparents will be the ones looking after the children if both parents are working. In terms of evaluating, you've got this point in your pack, which is, I'm putting a tick there because it's a bit of a positive evaluation, because there is evidence to suggest that he's right, which is that most people who are divorced are getting remarried. So although the divorce rate has increased, he's saying that there still isn't that much diversity because many people are still remarrying. and a reconstituted family might even be one version of the neo-conventional family. But ultimately, his main point is that most people want to be in some form of the nuclear family, but they might just adapt it to suit their needs. So there's a little bit of diversity, some reconstituted families, some traditional nuclear families, some dual earner families, but they're all similar in their structure. So pause the PowerPoint and have a read of that section on Chester. You may wish to read it twice so that you can really take it in. But if you're ready, then let's have a look at the criticism. So an evaluation criticism point, which you could add into your packs as a critical evaluation, is that there is actually much more diversity today, like single parent families and lone person households, people just choosing to live completely on their own, and those kinds of things, which means that things have changed quite a lot. And that would be according to postmodernists. They would say there's more diversity than Chester is saying. So this is a good time to mention and sort of remind you all, I suppose, that sociology is very much a kind of discipline of grey area where there's no right and wrong. It's about a debate between the theorists who all think that their view is right and that their approach is right, and often have evidence to support it. But Chester's point here is a very good example of that, because postmodernists are saying that there's a lot more diversity, there's lots of different family types, whereas Chester is saying, well, actually, there is a bit of diversity, but they're all a different version of the nuclear family. So same-sex couples are just another version of the nuclear family. There's still two adults and children, and workers and non-workers and people that take on the roles. So debate between the theorists there. So the family has changed, but there still isn't much diversity. Add this in somewhere on there, that in terms of thinking about the debate and the topic we're looking at, he argues there's a bit more diversity, but there's not much. Still, most people are still in a version of the nuclear family. I feel like I rambled on quite a bit there, but hopefully it's helped and made sense. Email me if not. Okay, last key thinkers for that section on modern key thinkers, modernity and modern approaches, are the Rapoports, Rhona and Robert Rapoport, and they are a married couple who were writing around the time of the 1980s again, so sort of late modern era. And they argue, similarly to Chester, that there is some diversity at this time. So things are beginning to become a bit more diverse, but ultimately, again, that most of that diversity is kind of still situated around a nuclear family. So I'll explain what we mean here, and I'll also explain why we've got this image of some clogs. So clogs is just really an acronym to help you remember the 5 types of diversity that the Rapoports are talking about. Don't be writing clogs in an essay because it's not a concept. It is just a way to help you remember these different types. So we've got cultural diversity. So the Rapoports recognise that there are different cultures present in society due to migration, and those different cultures have different values with regards to family life. So for example, Southeast Asian families tend to be bigger. So there's diversity in terms of that. There is perhaps like 2 adults and a few children, but there might be more children than in a typical white British family. And there also might be stronger links with grandparents. So there is some diversity there. They also recognise that when we're each at our different life stages, we are therefore in different family types. So when you're young, really young, you might be in a nuclear family, and then you might move out once you're an adult and live alone, and then you might be cohabiting for a bit, and then you might be married. So for them, they're saying that there is a limited amount of diversity because people are doing things at different life stages in comparison to perhaps in the past where people would have only moved out of home once they were actually married. They're recognising there's that little shift in diversity there. There's also this organisational diversity, which is in regards to how the family organises itself and its roles, and that each family does that slightly differently, so a slight bit of diversity there. There's generational diversity, where each generation that's born has slightly different values to the one before. So if there's lots of different generations living in society, then there's therefore lots of different values about the family and different family types. So you may wish to think about, if you think about your own values in terms of the family compared to your grandparents, how are they different, and how will your family life perhaps be different to theirs? That's what we mean by generational diversity. So some slight variations between the generations. And lastly, in terms of social class, the Rapoports note that there may be some differences between the different social classes, and that there may be different family structures within each class. So for example, that middle class families might have more traditional values than the working class. So pause and have a read, please, of that section, and you may need to read that twice because there's quite a lot there. Now you've had like an overview, read about it in a little bit more detail. And again, applying it to the debate, is there diversity or not? According to the Rapoports, there is some diversity due to those 5 things, those 5 elements: cultural, life stage, organisational, generational and social class differences, but there's not actually that much diversity. There's just sort of these variations of the nuclear family. So for this modern era, we're looking at key thinkers who at the time they were writing were saying either that there was no diversity or that there's a little bit but not a lot. And again, that's because at the time they were writing, they were probably correct. But whether they're relevant or not today is a different question. So what I would like you to do to finish off this first lesson is to have a go at these knowledge check questions one at a time. So ideally what I'd like you to do now is to grab a piece of paper, and then I'm going to give you each question one at a time with a little bit of time to answer it. So you can do it like we would be doing a quiz in class, and then you can go back and check your answers afterwards in your pack. So we'll see how much you've learned today. So question 1 is, which key thinker argued that we now have a neo-conventional family? What is the name of the key thinker who talks about the neo-conventional family? Question 2. Which key thinkers use clogs to describe the diversity of families? What's the name of those 2 key thinkers we just looked at who talk about 5 stages of diversity? Question number 3. Which type of diversity refers to the difference in values between your age group and those who are older than you? So which letter of clogs and what does it mean is relating to the difference in values between your age group and older age groups than you? Number 4. Which key thinker was writing in the 1950s, arguing that the traditional nuclear family was the best? So be careful here. There's 2 really that you can choose from that are talking about the traditional nuclear family. Which one was it that was in the 1950s? Number 5. A way of studying the lives of individuals by considering the choices that they make and how they impact on their lifestyle. So this is a bit of a throwback in a way to looking at the theories where we talked about the life cycle and the life course. So which one of those is the one that's focusing on the choices of individuals and their journey through life, rather than seeing it as a continuous repetitive thing where everyone does it the same? So life course or life cycle. Question number 6, which type of diversity in the clogs thing refers to the differences between families with different income levels. And question number 7, what are those 5 types of diversity identified by the Rapoports? Most questions there are on the Rapoports because I guess they have the most to say, really. Okay, 5 types of diversity in the CLOGS acronym. And I will just quickly go through the answers now so you can check as you go. So for this first one, you should have Chester. I'm not going to try and write all of them because it would take me ages. Chester is the neo-conventional family. Then you've got the Rapoports, so Rapoport and Rapoport for the CLOGS thing. That's awful, isn't it? Isn't it? Which type of diversity is about the difference in values between your age group and the older ones? It's generational. Which key thinker argued that in the 1950s traditional nuclear was best? Is Parsons. What do we call a way of studying the lives of individuals by looking at their choices? That one is the life course, not the life cycle. So I'm putting LCO for life course. Which type of diversity refers to the differences between families with different income levels? That one is social class. And then the 5 types of diversity you should have are cultural, life stage, organisational, generational, and social class. So take a few minutes to read over everything you've just covered today. Redo the PowerPoint if you need to, because it's only half an hour long, so you should be spending more like an hour on this lesson and looking through all of the knowledge. And that brings us to a lesson break. So I'm going to just pause there and I think I might send you. I'm going to pause.